Hello and welcome to this very special broadcast. Prime Minister Modi is set to depart for Russia for a crucial two-day diplomatic visit. This is Modi's first visit to Russia since the Ukraine war began. The Modi-Putin bilateral will be keenly watched around the world. The 22nd India-Russia bilateral summit will be held parallel to the NATO meeting in Washington. From defense, energy, oil, Indians stranded in Russia, trade imbalances to increase economic cooperation, the two countries have redefined what has been a historical friendship in the past 10 years particularly. With the Prime Minister having asserted that this is not an era of war, will Russia's invasion of Ukraine cast its shadow on the bilateral summit? What are the larger geopolitical undertones of this meet? Can the two nations carve out a roadmap for the new world order? All of that and more on this very special broadcast. In fact, I'm being joined by Saskia Taylor. She's joining us from Moscow. She is a senior Russia Today presenter. Thanks very much, Saskia, for being with us this evening. I'm going to come across to you for all the latest. But first, a look ahead to what is expected in the next 2 days in this report. Prime Minister Narendra Modi all set to meet Russian President Vladimir Putin on a two-day visit to Russia for the 22nd India-Russia bilateral summit. This will be PM Modi's first bilateral visit after being sworn in for the third consecutive term last month. Prime Minister Modi and President Putin have met 16 times in the last 10 years. Two key focus areas are the persistent trade imbalances between the countries and the release of Indians forced into fighting the Russia-Ukraine war.
In last 3 years, trade have expanded, crossed $65 billion. We would discuss and look at further increasing this trend of co-production, as we say, of defense items in India. Connectivity, similarly, is very important for trade and also people to people exchanges. International north-south transport corridor is very much on the agenda, and there have been some cargo movements along that. New routes are also coming up, Arctic route or Northern Sea route as it is called.
It's a great pleasure to meet the extended members of the SCO family today.
The visit signals the importance accorded by India to Russia, a long-time ally. President Putin and Prime Minister Modi met at the SCO summit in Samarkand in 2022. Fast forward to 2024, while both President Putin as well as China's Premier Xi attended the SCO summit in Kazakhstan, Prime Minister Modi gave it a skip. External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar read out the Prime Minister's message. In a subtle pointer to China, also a close ally of Russia, India said respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity is essential for connectivity and infrastructure projects, as are non-discriminatory trade rights and transit regimes. India called upon SCO to deliberate seriously on these aspects.
They would also share perspectives on regional and global developments of mutual interest. They would also assess the status of bilateral engagements in groupings such as BRICS, Shanghai Cooperation Organization, G20, East Asia Summit, and the UN.
The NATO summit in Washington will play out parallel to the 22nd India-Russia bilateral summit. In Washington, a key focus area will be the Russia-Ukraine war. Prime Minister Modi's no era for war dictum defines India's stand on the festering conflict.
आज का युग युद्ध का है नहीं.
And though India has not explicitly criticized Putin's war on Ukraine, PM Modi has expressed some reservations about the war during the last in-person meeting. What has become a recurring feature of PM Modi's diplomacy, he is expected to interact with the Indian community in Russia as well, amid all the hectic bilaterals. With Vishal Vivek, Bureau Report, NDTV. What are the larger implications of this crucial diplomatic visit? Saskia Taylor continues to be with us. So Saskia, what is the expectation in Russia? The Prime Minister, of course, has visited Russia multiple times in the past, but this time it's going to be a crucial one given the fact that it's a new geopolitical reality. What is the expectation in Moscow as we speak?
Oh, look, it's always a pleasure and an honor when a leader as experienced, and obviously as respecters, as Narendra Modi visits Moscow. And of course, it is extra special because my understanding is that it's his first bilateral visit since being re-elected to his third term back in June. I think the truth is that I'm not opening any secret when I say that Moscow and India have long enjoyed a very fruitful and stable relationship. It's a partnership that's long-standing and it's time-tested. And I think it's actually quite unique that it has endured over so many decades. And really, we see cooperation in almost every single sphere, whether I'm talking trade or energy security, whether that's defense, which of course is a key pillar of the partnership, space, whether we're also seeing the building of nuclear power plants. So I really think that there is always going to be more room for cooperation. I'm sure, for example, the Russians would always welcome any tips from the Indian cricket team, fresh off their victory of the T20 World Cup. But I really think it's just going to be a consolidation of really the positive cooperation that we've seen since the Soviet Union. Potentially some memorandums of agreements might be signed, as we saw at the last bilateral meeting in 2021. So I think a consolidation of a friendship that I think has stood the test of time.
Absolutely, a friendship that has stood the test of time. That's very well put. But how has this relationship changed in the past 10 years? Because, of course, we have seen turbulent times, particularly since the Ukraine war, whether it was crude oil or, other geopolitical events that could have been sort of impediments to the relationship between India and Russia. But India and Russia have been able to survive those with very clever diplomatic balancing and a diplomatic tightrope. But how do you think this relationship has changed, particularly since Prime Minister Modi took over back in 2014?
Well, I mean, you talk there about how, despite obviously any instability in the world, this friendship has endured. And I think it's really a great testament to India's commitment to strategic autonomy. It understands that it is reluctant to align itself with any single power. And that policy of neutrality has really served it incredibly well. We see it now emerging as a key player of influence on the global arena. We see it as a country who can potentially be a mediator in any conflict. We also see it obviously benefiting financially from its good relationship with Russia. I'm talking specifically about how the fact that it's importing something like 1.8 million barrels of crude oil every single day. And it's thought that over the last 2 years, it saved itself something like $13 billion as a result. So I think the fact that it continues to be pragmatic, calm, and rational, and I think it knows that it benefits from that, and that places it in a really good position to have partnerships with countries both East and West. I mean, we've seen obviously in the defense sector, we're seeing joint production, we're seeing design sharing, we're seeing technological cooperation, we're seeing Russian technology and know-how that's being exported to India, where it's then being indigenously manufactured. Now, of course, that is a really smart business move from India because it means that it's building up its own self-reliance on an issue as crucial as national security. That we've seen grow year on year. Only recently, I was reading a joint venture, I think it was the India and Russia Rifles Limited. They announced that they had supplied the Indian Army with 35,000 assault rifles. I'm not a military expert. I think they were AK-203s. Again, this is the fruit of hard labor. And of course, when we're talking about how things have changed, I mean, my goodness, has the world changed in terms of the global order? And that is, of course, in no small part due to both India and Russia cooperating in a number of forums, whether that's BRICS, whether that's, like you mentioned in the report, the SCO. They're changing not just the idea of representation and giving countries that were previously ignored, largely in the global south, a voice, but they're also talking about, well, how about we trade in national currencies? It doesn't seem entirely logical that 100% of crude oil trade, for example, in the last few decades, has been conducted in US dollars. Last year, 20% was conducted in non-US dollar currencies. So these are big shifts that I would say really are going to be written in the pages of history.
Absolutely. In fact, both India and Russia have always championed a multipolarism, in the sense that they've always supported a multipolar world order. But two issues, Saskia, very quickly have emerged as the defining issues of this particular visit. One, of course, the trade imbalances that have been much talked about, and secondly, the issue of Indians stranded in Russia. How do you see, the two nations navigating these important issues?
I definitely think that those are two issues that are going to come up. They've come up before, and my understanding is that behind the scenes they're also being worked on. Trade imbalance, absolutely. You mentioned at the start that the historic trade turnover last year reached $65.7 billion. But like you said, it's very unequal. So India imports around $60 billion. Russia only imports $5 billion.
Yes.
They absolutely have to work on a way in order to create a more even playing field. So I suspect that they're going to be discussing the ways in which that perhaps India can focus on enhancing its exports to India. I think an area that will be very mutually beneficial for both parties would be, for example, the semiconductor industry. There are also other ways. If you look, for example, at the agreement, the split up currency agreement between Tehran and New Delhi, they do about 55% of their trading in rupees, and then the rest of it is paid off via euros, wired via Turkey. Now, Moscow is obviously not going to accept euros, but perhaps another currency like the Emirati dirham. So there are ways out of it. It's just where there's a will, there's a way.
Absolutely.
Regarding the Indians that are stranded in Moscow, that is obviously, I know, something that External Affairs Minister Jaishankar raised with his counterpart, Sergei Lavrov. I understand that about 10 Indians so far have been evacuated from Russia, but there are still about 20 to 25 individuals. I do not know the circumstances of how they ended up. Having done some research, I understand that what happens is they were almost lured to Russia looking for education or jobs, and then some human trafficking racket got involved and duped them into serving on the front lines. I also understand that the Indian CBI managed to stamp out one of those rackets and make arrests. I think, given that 10 Indians have already been returned at the request, obviously, of New Delhi to their homeland, it shows clearly that there is a channel of communication between New Delhi and Moscow and the respective defense ministries on this issue. So I personally, if you're asking my opinion, I have absolutely no doubt that that is an issue that will be very easily resolved.
Saskia, thanks very much for joining us from Moscow.
It was a pleasure.
We're keen, as I said in my introduction, this bilateral summit will be keenly watched from around the world, and we will, of course, continue to track all the details from Moscow. Thanks very much, Saskia, for joining us. But I have a wonderful panel this evening. I'm being joined by former Foreign Secretary Shashank, Professor Anuradha Chenoy, a former chairperson, Center for Russian and Central Asian Studies, JNU, Ambassador Dr. V.B. Soni, former diplomat who has served in various capacities in Indian diplomatic missions in Moscow. Manju Seth, a former diplomat, is also with us, and Ambassador Meera Shankar, former ambassador of India to the United States. Thanks all very much for being with us this evening. Mr. Shashank, going across to you first, how do you see this crucial visit of the Prime Minister to Russia? Of course, he has visited Russia multiple times in his tenure as Prime Minister, but this time, it's a new geopolitical reality. The Russia-Ukraine war is still very much on, even though the world seems to have lost interest in that war, but it's still killing people, it's still destroying property. How do you see this visit as a defining one?
Well, in the last few years, we had paid a lot of attention to strengthen our relations with USA and with Europe.
Yes.
However, what we found that we could not make much headway, and especially lately, one of the strong points of our relationship was people-to-people relations with the West.
Absolutely.
But lately, we have been finding that Indians are getting killed in Canada and USA, UK in large numbers. Secondly, there are attempts to attack the Indian interests, the Indian embassies, Indian diplomatic missions, consular missions by Khalistanis or by Pakistani-based and promoted terrorists. So I think, and we find that these Western countries have not been able to pay much attention to these issues. Secondly, President Trump had asked us to cut down our imports of oil from Iran. We had done that, even though we suffered badly. So what has happened is that in the last 2 years, we have recognized that people in India are saying that what is happening? You are trying to promote relations with the West, but what about our old tested friends in Russia who are willing to give us so many things, which we are not getting from anywhere else. So I think the Prime Minister is the government is being almost forced by the people of India to go and promote relations once again with the Russians in a very strong manner. And I think if our Foreign Minister has already talked about it and Prime Minister is going to do things, so we will have a strong support at the national level for whatever efforts are made by India and Russia to come closer.
Several important points there. Ambassador Soni, let me come to you. India has shown, particularly in the past 1.5 to 2 years, that we have sort of very craftfully walked that diplomatic tightrope that we have said. Our Prime Minister has said that it's not an era of war, and we have emphasized on international forums that we have our own historical relationship with Russia, and that is important to us. So we have, in a sense, kept our interests intact despite sort of being critical, not very sort of openly critical, but critical nonetheless of Russia's invasion of Ukraine.
So let me first of all say that Russia has been our important ally during those difficult times. Things have changed. We are moving on. We are no more imbalance on one side, but the world is now realizing the balancing role which India can play. But the West must realize what is happening in Ukraine is their war. It is the problem which has been created by them, and they want everybody else to join in as cheerleaders. And to my mind, India is not going to do it. It is going to take a stance which is very balanced. So even though we are getting very close to the West, US in particular, and we will continue to do so because we are diversifying our relationship from one source to another in fields which are again very much diversified. So we would take a stance which is in the best interest of the humanity in one, and India in particular. We can't just be joining the bandwagon and say, look, whatever is being done against Russia is our stand. So that's not what we are going to do.
In fact, I'm going to touch upon the relationship with the West and how sort of that has been a bit of a balancing act. But Professor Anuradha Chinoy, speaking of our interests, well, whether it is the defense sector, whether it is crude oil, or our increasing trade. In fact, our bilateral trade is expected to reach $25 billion by 2025. Break it down for us. Why is Russia such an important diplomatic partner for India?
Well, look, number one, there is a huge continuity in India-Russia relations, and it's very comprehensive. So it includes the defense aspect, it includes the channels of communication, the corridors, the nuclear support that they have, space production, India's space production and ventures, the transfer of technology, oil and gas, even joint manufacturing, payments, the fact that the rupee-ruble trade, which was there and then ended, and again there's an attempt to revive it, of trading in national currency, Russia support continuously. So it is a completely conflict-free relationship. With the West, we are trying to build relationships. There are challenges and they're building blocks. But here, we're not trying to build it. It's a process which has been on for decades now, and it continues, and it is across the political spectrum. Whichever Indian Prime Minister, whichever political parties, there's no friction in this relationship. There is and there is a support that India has given to Ukraine, and India can play a bridge. And I think Mr. Putin is going to ask Prime Minister Modi that he uses his good offices with the West to put some pressure on them. Not that the West is going to listen.
Yes.
But India does have a role now in the international system on critical issues.
And in being a mediator, as many would say, as two life conflicts continue. But Meera Shankar, come in on this, because India has sort of made it clear that there's almost like a new world order. India has independent relationships, whether it is vis-a-vis Russia, whether it's with Ukraine, whether it's with the Arab world, or whether it's with the US. Of course, in the past 2 years, past 5 years perhaps, we've seen India's growing ties with the US as well. How do you see the West reading this important bilateral visit and, of course, the Prime Minister's meeting with President Putin?
Well, I think that the West accepts that Russia has been a traditional partner of India. They're not very comfortable with it, but I think we have learned to navigate our differences. For instance, over Ukraine, I think the West expected that India would support their position on Ukraine, but we didn't. We took our own stand because we understood that there was a wider context, a historical context and a current geopolitical context within which this conflict was playing out. And we were also able to explain to the West the rationale for our, not condemning Russia, taking a different and nuanced position on Ukraine. So I think the West has reluctantly, but nevertheless pragmatically, agreed to not let this issue become a touchstone of the broader relationship, because there are areas where we have strong convergences with the West, for example, in building a better Asian balance, which is more stable. And on the other hand, we also have, a historical strategic relationship with Russia.
Right.
I think the one weakness in the relationship with Russia, it was very strong in defense, nuclear energy, space, but the one area of weakness traditionally was trade and the economic relationship, which had collapsed after the rupee-ruble trading arrangement came to an end. Now, with the purchases of oil, with Russia having, lost its European oil market, they are more open to selling to India. And India has been looking for a while to see if they could, build relationships with Russia in strategic resource areas.
Absolutely.
So
in fact, one of the key focus areas of this bilateral visit.
Add one thing.
Sure.
I think one interesting aspect which could emerge is that because now we are purchasing oil in rupees, Russia is accumulating huge rupee reserves.
Right.
So they have to import more from India, but they're also looking at investments in Indian infrastructure projects.
Yes.
And some reports in the press say it could be up to $50 billion over 5 years. Now, that would be a very significant shift.
Yes, if that bilateral investment indeed grows to $50 billion, as you said, it would be a great shift. But Manju said, come in on this, because trade imbalances, are something that have been discussed in great detail in the context of India and Russia. And as ma'am is also pointing out, that, that could be corrected if Russia invests more in India, and of course, given the fact that now we are trading in rupee. How do you see the two countries solving this problem of trade imbalances?
Absolutely, it's going to be a tough task and a big challenge for both countries to be able to bridge this gap, which is heavily in favor of Russia, and the products that are currently being exported are very limited from India, and so that needs to be expanded. And India is looking at increasing exports and the IT, in the IT sector, in agriculture, in pharmaceuticals already there, but many more areas need to be looked at. And as you mentioned very rightly, investments. Already I think it's around 25 billion two-way or $50 billion two-way investments, and they need to be further. It needs to be further ramped up. And what are the areas? Infrastructure, co-production, in India, and also in IT sector, in the IT information technology sector, and the emerging technologies like, of course, AI, etc. So all that, and as mentioned also in your report, the chips are required to be made in India. That can be an area where there are strengths in both countries, and that can be co-production can be ramped up in that, and that will be part of the trade relationship to some extent, where more investments are coming in, and our trade basket is diversified for products being exported to India. Exported to Russia.
That's very well put. But Mr. Shashank, as Professor Chinoy earlier said, that this is largely a conflict-free relationship, a friction-free relationship. But there are many sticking points in the sense that, Russia's proximity with Pakistan, Russia's growing ties with, say, China. In fact, the timing of this summit is also extremely interesting, that you have the NATO meeting in Washington as well. In the larger diplomatic context, what are the key messages that will be sent out as the Prime Minister arrives in Moscow tomorrow?
India has been a major partner of Russia to such an extent that whenever there is a conflict type of adversarial type of relationship between India and China, the Russians advise the Chinese not to put pressure on India. As regards Pakistan, I think Russia has been the only country, or Soviet Union was the only country which was willing to go for the veto to protect India's rights. Now, of course, that situation has changed because Security Council now takes most decisions without a veto by mutual consultations. And India is trying to promote those consultations with all the members of the Security Council. But it remains very important that we should not allow Russia to become somehow a secondary partner to China, number one. And number two, on account of China, to somehow support Pakistan in some way. Because Pakistanis are very keen somehow to stifle our relationship with Russia on one side, with USA on the other, and with the Chinese, of course, they want to have some kind of a two-front confrontation with India in the next 10, 15 years. And because every resource in Pakistan is under the control of the army, and the army is first rate, I have no doubt about it. So we have to take charge of our own interests and see that what Russia can do to us, Vladivostok, Madras, trade relationship, the INSTC, promoting relations, Central Asian countries, Afghanistan and all that. So we have to maneuver these relations.
Yes.
So that the Americans do not put their sanctions on this infrastructure connectivity project with Russia.
And
so
I think India has done that in the past, and keeping its own interests above pressures, say, from the West or other countries. But of course, it is going to be a diplomatic tightrope. But thanks all very much for joining us this evening on this very important story. We will, of course, bring you all the latest from Moscow as well. Our reporter Vasudha will get us all the latest updates. That's all the time that we have on the show from all of us here. Good night.